Well, here I am again, sliding away, with apologies to Paul Simon. The slide rules that you see here are manufactured by and sold by Ll1 Hemmi of Japan. They were probably the largest manufacturer of slide rules in the history of slide rules. They made rules not only for sale in Japan, but also for export. And the Frederick Post Company had many of their slide rules made by Ll1 Hemmi. You've probably already seen those if you watched the video I did on Frederick Post slide rules. You saw 3 there made by Ll1 Hemmi. The 1462H, I think it was, and then the 1460 Versalog and the 1460 Versalog 2. So what we have here are 6 more Ll1 Hemmi slide rules. 2 of them are the same model. These top 2 are model 153s, and I'll talk about them first. They are different. They were manufactured at different times. In fact, the slide rule at the top is probably the oldest slide rule that I own. It was manufactured in 1931 by Ll1 Hemmi, and it doesn't even have a model number on it. Only that first year did they make this. It was the 153 with no model number. And then after that, they began putting model numbers on their slide rules. So let's take a look at each of these. Here is a chart of the models we're going to talk about. The first one is the 153 I talked about a minute ago. Then a later model 153. Both of these made before World War II. Then you may remember that we looked at the Post 1462H in a previous video. That was made in 1949, the one I have anyway, and was called the Hemmi 159. I don't think they ever they didn't market very many of these under the 159 name, I think out of deference to Post, and the fact that they were selling so many of these in the United States through the Frederick Post Company as the Post 1462H. I think they decided that it was better just not to try to compete with their own model in Japan. So the next one is the 251, which was often called a mechanical engineering slide rule. And here is a page from the Hemmi catalog that you see in which they talk about the 251. And while I'm at it, let me show you the page of the 153, also from the catalog, 10-inch number 153, that they called an electrical engineering slide rule. So these first 2 were called electrical engineering, and I think the reason they did this is although they didn't have special scales for things like reactants and things of that sort, which we'll see down at the bottom, this one, the 266, did have, is they contained scales that were useful for hyperbolic functions, including a special scale called the Gudermannian. And the Gudermannian scale, I'm not going to tell you about how it works, but when we get to the 153s in a second, you'll find a nice video by Professor Herning on the 153 that he only made a few months ago. So I suggest, actually it's a 3-part video, I suggest you might want to look at that one. So the 251 was the mechanical engineering slide rule. Then we'll look at the 258, only by retrospect. You may recall that the Post Versalog 1460 was actually the Hemmi 258. Now they did sell a few more of these in Japan than they did the 159. But once again, they deferred to the large number of rules being sold by Post and decided to discontinue marketing this in Japan. The 259 was called a mechanical engineering rule and was essentially the rule that they did market heavily in Japan and also elsewhere. And we'll look at that one. And then they improved this by adding a DI scale and called it the 259D, which they continued selling under the mechanical engineering, and understand these were general slide rules. Finally, the one that is sort of the prize of my collection, which is the 266, that was produced in 1961 and was intended for electrical engineering. And we'll look at this one in a little more detail, and then we'll look at it again in a future video when we look at slide rules that are specifically intended for electrical engineering. Before we look at the individual rules, this was a case that Sun Hemmi tended to use for their slide rules. This one is quite worn. But this was the logo. I think you may be able to see it that way. But most of the slide rules that Hemmi sold, they sold in boxes like this. Now, of course, when they sold them through the Frederick Post Company, there was a holster that had a Post logo on it. And I don't know who made those holsters. It might have been Hemmi. I don't think so. But most of the slide rules, at least that they sold in Japan, they sold in boxes like this, or in boxes like this. This is a Hemmi, and let's see if we can see a bamboo slide rule, and you see it's a box like this, not in real good shape. Here are the two 153s actually two of the three 153s that I own. I actually own another one, but it's very much like this one. You may notice that the number 153 is written on this rule, but not on this one. Instead, this one just simply lists the U.S. patents that applied to this rule. So this one was originally made in 1931. A year or so later, they started making this version, and they added the number 153 to the engraving. So let's take a look at the scales on this rule. And by the way, the scales are the same for both of these, so I'll just show you one. That will allow me to zoom in a little more. On this side, there we go. All right, got it a little better. You see it has an L, a K, an A, then a B, a CI, C, D, T, and then at the bottom is this kind of special scale. Professor Herning calls it their killer app, the Gudermannian. As far as I know, the only slide rule that has this scale is the 153 by Sun Hemmi. And by the way, just so that you'll get some idea, here is you may notice that the type font is different on this 153 than on that one. Except for the number and the type font, I think these rules are identical, but they did have to completely set up a new engraving for this slide rule. On the opposite face, you see that you have log scales at the bottom. Then you have various. This is a P, a Q, and a Q prime scale, and they are used in ways I'll defer to Professor Herning in his video on how they are used, but basically they are like the Pythagorean scales on some European slide rules where you can solve triangles, and they're basically used for trig functions. You may also notice that there is an R theta, which is a radian measure, and above that is a theta scale. Theta is in degrees, R theta, of course, in radians, and this is one of the few slide rules I know in which you can read or do trig functions either with degrees or with radians. Remember now, this slide rule was originally produced in 1931. That was long before radians were even generally taught in general trig classes. Advanced trig, yes, but most trig in the time did not have radian measure. So this is a bit ahead of its time. And finally, below it are three log scales. You may notice that this rule does not allow you to do log less than 1. The next Hemmi rule we're going to look at is the 251. You notice here it's a relatively conventional setup, log L scale, the folded D and F scales, the folded inverse C scale, the inverse C scale CI, and then C and D, and then beneath it is a scale called the DI, which came and went on Hemmi slide rules over the years, as we will see, and eventually came back late in the slide rule era on the Ll1 slide rule. On this side is the K and AB and CD scales of the conventional Mannheim, and then in between B and C are the tangent, sine, and sine tangent scales. Then beneath that are the Ll1, Ll2, and Ll3 scales, which are basically the same as what we saw on the 153. The next slide rule that I'd like to look at is this one. Let's start on this side. This is the 259, which the Hemmi called the mechanical engineer's slide rule, but it's just basic, or I should say fairly advanced, but nonetheless it's applicable to virtually all mathematics and engineering. The one thing that's new about this is they added the Ll0 scale here that allowed you to do exponents less than 1. So in order of from top to bottom, you have the L scale and the K, then AB, then TS, ST, C, and D, so the Mannheim with trig, and then LL0 and LL/0, which just the /0 in red just means exponents between 0 and 1. On the other side, you see a full complement of what are called symmetric log-log scales. And by symmetric, I mean that the top three, which are the LL/1/2 and /3 scales, are symmetric with the LL1, LL2, and LL3 scales. These scales in black are for exponents greater than 1, and the scales in red are for exponents less than 1. In between are the more or less traditional folded D and C scales, the folded C inverse scale, the C inverse scale, and then of course C and D. This is the same model 259 that we just saw, but a later version of it called the 259D. The major addition to this is the addition of the DI scale here. Once again, the rest of the scales are pretty much the same: L, K, A, B, T, S, ST, C, and D, and then that DI scale. And then beneath it are the log-log scales that we saw on the original 259. On the other side is pretty much the same, so the only major difference between this one and the one we just saw, the earlier rule, is that DI scale. Here you have the symmetric log-log scales, the less than 1 in red, the greater than 1 in black, and then in between folded scales and the C and D scale. The 259D, there actually is another version called the DS, which I do not own, that removes the D scale, and yet it's still called a 259DS. I don't know why, or the DI scale. I don't know why they still called it a DS, but at any rate they did. And this rule is the Hemmi 266. And as I said earlier, it's the pride of my collection at any rate. These are very rare, hard to get a hold of, and usually command high prices. I was able to get this one at a reasonable price, but I still paid more for this rule than I did any of the other rules you've seen. You may notice that it has a lot of scales that are intended for the electrical engineer, including inductive reactance, capacitive reactance. There's a frequency scale, a couple of R scales where you can do parallel resistance, a scale for inductance and capacitance, an L scale. Now you don't want to confuse the inductance scale with the log scale, and then the Z scale and the resonant frequency scale. I'm not going to talk about the use of these scales in this video. Instead, I'm going to save those because some of these scales are common to some other rules that were intended specifically for electrical engineering and electronic technicians. I will, however, move down to this end of the rule to show you that the scales are different on this end, at least some of them. For example, some of these scales have a different labeling because they're used for a slightly different purpose. But they are still added to the scales, and they're really extensions of this, or I should say, the other end of the scales, which come from the left end of the rule. Now I'm going to flip up here, and you see there that it says 266, and then I'm going to show you some unique scales. You may notice, if you look right here, that this top scale ends in the middle of the rule, and that is an Ll1 scale. And one of the reasons that it ends in the middle of the rule is it only applies to the right-hand end of the A and B scales, and it is a log-log rule for numbers less than 1. If we move to the end of the rule, you see another log-log scale that's somewhat unique. It's a shortened Ll3 scale. You notice it only extends from here to here. Then beneath that are an LL/2, which is for numbers less than 1 in red, and an LL2 in black. And those scales are back to back on the same scale. Then your more or less traditional AB, and here is a unique scale, BI. That's an inverted B scale. Then CI. Notice there's no CIF. Then CD, and beneath that is a unique scale, dBl. That's for decibels log. In other words, the logarithm of the decibel. That's kind of unique in that a decibel is already a logarithmic measure, so it's the log of a log. And then beneath that are S and T. Now notice this is unique. S and T are on the body, not on the slide of this rule. So this one, this rule represents the, I would call it the pinnacle of my collection at any rate. I like it partly because it was a late rule from son Hemmi. It's in good condition, but especially because it has all of the scales that are intended for use by electrical engineers that you saw on the other side. So look forward to some future videos, one perhaps on electronic slide rules. That I don't mean slide rules that operate electronically. I mean slide rules that are intended for use by electrical and electronic engineers. I also plan to do a video in the future on the vector or hyperbolic slide rules that also were intended for electrical engineers, but those will be in the future. So I hope you look forward to those, and in the meantime, have a nice day.